You've given us already a foundation for our understanding of this process, which in South Africa unfolded almost organically, as you explained historically. And you started out with the notions of the right to know. But I think the central issues that we have to talk about is this notion of impunity. And that seems to become a part of the culture of the current state of affairs, where we have a number of people, from commissioners of police to financial advisors or presidents, who are found guilty in courts of law, but who walk free. We have miners who ask for a living wage, but they are met by gunfire. You mentioned the Marikana. In many ways, it seems as if we have just simply changed the color of the oppressor. You simply change the government from one that it looks more friendly to us, but which is actually imitating very many of the kinds of grotesque acts of forgetting their responsibility. More so, if one watched the parliamentary debates on accountability on this matter, on the Marikana, it is atrocious. The arrogance of government who would ask a member of parliament to shut up, for example, and not provide a very clear obligation of the state to explain. My personal difficulty with that is that we have created, in very many ways, a kind of democracy that doesn't imitate very many of the early principles that you mentioned. You also said that the ANC accused the TRC in its court application of criminalizing the struggle. I think the struggle has now created more criminals than it ought to have, because the unfinished business that you so eloquently talked about was about social democrats. And that is essentially what people, and that we mentioned as we came down the stairwell over here, has already been put into a kind of euphemism in South Africa, into managerial talk. Economic, social, and cultural rights are called a lack of service delivery. And in that way, we have no rights discussion, but some manager is not very good at his or her job. That is problematic, I think. And I think you put your finger on the fact that the unfinished business is about reconciliation. Some of us were talking, 15 years ago, about a ministry for reconciliation, if you recall. That this was going to be decades-long work. Perhaps that Ministry of Reconciliation could have attended to some of these things in a much more realistic way. That's my observation of what you have to say, but I think there's an audience out there that have been listening to you in very rapt attention and might want to ask you a few questions.
Yes, thank you. I suppose it's a comment and a question. A couple of months ago, I went on a organized visit, a South African history tour, and one of the places that we were taken to was Vlakplaas, which is obviously not open to the public, but the person taking us had some access through he knew the family that were living there. And what struck me was how normal the place was, in the sense that nothing has changed. The building, apart from a couple of small buildings that have been knocked down since the 80s, the structure remains the same. Eugene de Kock's office that he built the bomb for Beckham Emlangeni is still there. There's even still hooks in the wall that were used for torture. There's the Braai place there that was... It shocked me that it's just been left. It's not a memorial site. It's not a site for anything. There's a family living there, putting up crosses, trying to ward off evil spirits. And I found it just staggering that it was almost symbolic of a part of our history that we're trying to ignore, but we can't, because it's bubbling up under the surface in various forms. And what you said also shocked me, that there's only 3 prosecutions, and that death squad, and I've been reading Jacques Poe's book about the death squads, and the fact that only Eugene de Kock is behind bars of this appalling group of people, black and white, again, is staggering. I suppose my question, within that, a comment from you, but also what I get the sense that the TRC, in a way, exonerated a lot of people from interrogating their own systems of belief and complicity in apartheid. And I refer particularly to whites. The fact that if I look at my parents' generation and part of those slightly older than me, Mandela's forgiveness, Tutu's forgiveness, and the the ability that they had to forgive exonerated people from even asking themselves whether they were ever wrong. And now you find whites saying, it's been 18 years, let's get over it, which is, again, outrageous. But I almost get a sense that they were allowed to do that because they were given this blanket forgiveness, and I find that problematic as well.
I have a couple of comments and then a question. One is with respect to your comment about culture of impunity. I'm a former South African and I lived here for 27 years. I now live in the United States, and I would say that there's a culture of impunity there in the government. It takes a slightly different form, but there are people, for example, in Wall Street and in government that are literally getting away with the most incredible kinds of crimes. Maybe we call them white-collar crimes, maybe there are no deaths involved, there certainly are socioeconomic victims involved. And I think that this culture of impunity is something that is coursing through the entire world right now when we look at government and government behavior, because there is definitely a lack of transparency. Not to say that that in any way ameliorates or excuses what's going on in South Africa. That's my one comment. My other comment is that at the Origin Center there is currently an art exhibition of 48 artworks entitled A Just Society. It's on until the end of September. It's 48 artworks that look at the impact of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the impacts of apartheid. I happen to be the artist. I'm not trying to promote my own work, but I think it does tie in very, very well with this. And there is a book that I wrote called A Just Society, which actually covers, in part, several of the issues that you raised in your presentation. My question to you is, if Kulumani is successful in getting the government, or getting a movement to get the government to really give these reparations, do you think that there's a chance that some kind of commission could be formed and some kind of recognized, established governmental body that will deal with this in a very serious way and incorporate in their work that mandate to look at the things that you talked about, which are the structural crimes of apartheid, socioeconomic? That's my question.
Yeah.
I was hoping you could elaborate a bit more on the concept you mentioned of nolo prosequi and the private prosecution you're bringing, because it sounds like a bit of a novel concept and certainly not one I've encountered in my legal career. So.
Thank you. If you also look at this field of socioeconomic rights, and I mean, for many of us who've been working in this field, even though we say that rights are indivisible, in a sense, the notion of that is more easily accepted in Africa and in Asia than it is in Western Europe or in Latin America. And so it is only now, and one of the things I didn't say was that, when Louis Jouenet was appointed by the Subcommission on Minority Rights to look into this question of impunity, there was another rapporteur as well, a man called Al-Haji Gisse, who in fact was mandated to look at the economic crimes and the whole socioeconomic rights questions. And his report actually came first. And he dealt with almost every one of the issues that we are grappling with today: odious debt, structural violence, economic crimes, corruption. But his report was so hot to handle because it began to make the link between what was happening in many countries and the role of transnational corporations, that in fact the subcommission at that time shelved his report. And it is only now, as many of us, after my work in Sierra Leone, where I had to look at the question of diamonds and the fact that you had so many different countries and companies involved in supporting the RUF, the rebel movement, who were responsible for the 10-year war, that people have begun to look at this issue. And of course the Arab Spring has brought that back home. And so one of the big questions that the Arab countries are looking at is, how do you deal with asset recovery when much of the assets are sitting in countries like Switzerland, in Dubai, in Qatar, and of course Malaysia. And when I was in Switzerland a few weeks ago, Swiss judges are beginning to ask themselves the question, when we get a request, how are we going to deal with it? Because I'm not sure many of you know, but the Haitian government brought an application for the return of the ill-gotten spoils of Duvalier. And of course, the Swiss government said, well, it should go back to him and his family. And yet, I believe that it should go back to the government. So these are some of the contradictions we're working out. Let me go to this first question. And if I look at this question, I mean, theoretically in this field, we believe that it's very important that you fact-find, that you individualize who is responsible, so that people don't bear the collective responsibility or the guilt. But if you look at the way in which I think international justice is structured, it kind of tends to look at an individual rather than this question of the structural, which I think is where we went wrong. So by focusing on the civil and political rights violations, when the victims first began to appear before hearings, white South Africa said they're exaggerating. But of course, when you had the perpetrator speaking, people said, we didn't know. And I think it's this dimension. Who do you have speaking in the amnesty hearings? They're mostly white Afrikaans men. And so it's very easy to stigmatize this as the group. But who are you dealing with? It's only in the political party hearings that suddenly you have the politicians having to respond to questions. But most of the politicians said, we didn't know. And even this year, President de Klerk, when he was being interviewed by Christian Amanpour, he could not bring himself to say that apartheid was a crime. And she continued to press him and say, but surely you have to acknowledge that it was morally repugnant. And even then, he couldn't actually bring himself to take that step. Now, many colleagues of mine, within the commission we were a mixed group of people, and my own deputy came from the world of